Hello, everyone. Good to see everyone. Thank you for joining, especially to our UK friends. I know it's not a holiday for you, so I know you're taking off time from school. To our American friends, Martin Luther King Day, so I like it. Still working out the kinks, so maybe a little bit of a lag, but hopefully it will work. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about what is Tanach in Gush. Just want to make sure I can see everyone. Okay. Gallery. Okay. Yes, I can see everyone. What is Tanach? Why is Gush known for Tanach? Why is it such an important part of your chinuch? And I'll give a little bit of a model shiur in Tanach, Amir Hashem, if we have a little bit of time. Okay, so let me start with the following story. About, I don't know, 30 years ago, I'm interviewing a boy for the yeshiva. And the boy turns to me, I say, okay, and finish your interview. Do you have any questions? And he says, yes, Rabbi. Where are the good boys going next year? I want to know where the good boys are going next year. So I said, that's an interesting question. I don't know. Even if I did, I wouldn't tell you. Confidential information. But I have a question for you. What does it mean to be a good boy? How would you define being a good boy? So he said, Rabbi, the good boys are those that learn the most Gemara and that daven with the most kavana, which I thought was an adequate answer for an 18-year-old high school boy. I then asked him 3 or 4 questions to try to demonstrate that going to Israel is not just about doubling down on learning Gemara and davening, but stretching your avodas Hashem to areas which you don't get that much exposure to in Chutz La'aretz. One of the questions I asked him, for example, was, this was in 1995. 1995, there was a terrible helicopter accident where 2 helicopters of Israeli soldiers took off from the north to go into a mission in Lebanon. They collided in midair, and 72 soldiers were killed in one day. And before October 7th, that was probably the biggest loss of life in a non-military moment in the history of our state. And it was apocalyptic. I remember sitting with my wife, and we were watching the TV. There's no internet. And we watched 70 levayos in 2 days, and we're just crying and crying and crying till we could cry no more. And I asked this boy, what did you do after that event? And he said, well, I said some Tehillim, which was a perfectly legitimate response for a high school kid. But I asked him, I said, tell me, is the ability to cry when Am Yisrael suffers, and not just say Tehillim, but really cry and feel it deeply in pain, is that part of being a good boy? Is that part of your frumkeit? And he said it was. And then I asked him, it was Erev Shabbos, and I said, tonight you're going to sing all these beautiful parts of L'chadodi. Hitari, hitari, kivarech, kumi ari, livshi bigdei tifratei chami. I said, where do they come from? He didn't know. So I said, here's a Tanach, take the Tanach, and I'll show you. This is not part of the test. I just want to show you where they come from so that tonight when you daven, it'll be more meaningful to you. It's not part of the test. Just open up to Yeshaya, and I'll show you where they come from. These beautiful songs of Jewish renewal. He didn't open the Tanakh. He looked at me and he said, Rabbi, I don't know where Sefer Yeshaya is. So I said, well, tell me, is the ability not to be totally conversant in Tanakh, but at least to know where Sefer Yeshaya is that part of being a good boy? And he said, yes. And my point to him was that in America, you're exposed to 2 or 3 aspects of religious identity. But then when you come to Israel, we want to try not just to deepen them, but to stretch them and to help you see frumkeit in areas that you don't get that much exposure to in Chutz La'aretz. So that's the introduction to tonight's year. Tanach is something that American high school kids aren't so exposed to. Oh boy, my computer's really lagging. I apologize. I'll try to get it fixed by the next time. But you can hear me, right? Okay. The video's a little bit of a lag. Something that American high school kids are not that exposed to. And let me give you a little history. What happened over the last 900 years, 800 years, is that we retreated from Tanakh learning. Why did it happen? Probably because Christianity took over the Old Testament and they distorted it to support their ideology. And we decided, you know what, let's pull back and focus on Torah Shebaal Peh. So once you lose the tradition, you could be a huge Talmid Chacham. If your Rebbe didn't teach you Tanach, you're not going to know Tanach. So we retreated from it. We were far from the land of Tanakh, so a lot of the names and places didn't have so much currency for us. We didn't know where. Sometimes you'll hear Rashi say, I can prove to you that Hebron is in a mountain because I have a pasuk, and I just look out of my window and I see that Hebron is a mountain. And I know that Maras Machpelah is in the valley beneath the mountain. Rashi turns somersaults to explain how come in Parshas Vayeshev, Yosef leaves from Emek Hebron, where Hebron's on a mountain. Why is it called the Valley of Hebron? And I know that Hebron is a mountain with a steep drop to a valley where Maras Machpelah is. If you ever go to Maras Machpelah, you're driving down. So you didn't live in Eretz Yisrael, so a lot of these places didn't have that much meaning for you. And we focused on halacha. Halacha was necessary to survive, obviously. We're living in Chutz La'aretz, we need to know the halachos. So over the last 800-900 years, all of a sudden, Tanakh learning doesn't really get so much traction. And we focus on halacha, we focus on Shas, and people don't know how to learn Tanakh. Now, what happened about 150 years ago? Let's say 1880. 150 years ago is when the mass aliyah, Chovevei Tzion, this is not history in Zionism, we'll talk about that another time, but the first mass aliyah begins in 1880 and lasts till around 1920. All of a sudden, people are starting to come back to Israel. Even those that aren't coming back to Israel are getting much more interested in the land. And what does it mean? Even if you're living in Poland or in Vienna or in White Russia, the land is a lot more interesting to you. And not only is it a return to land, but for many people, this is part of redemption. Hashem is showing us a sign that history is shifting. So all of a sudden, the book about the land of Israel, the book of prophecies about redemption, the book about where certain landscapes are in Eretz Yisrael, the book of Jewish morality. Now we have a Jewish nation and a Jewish identity. What does it mean to be a moral person based on the spirit of our Nevi'im? All of a sudden, Tanakh becomes much more attractive and interesting than it was for the previous 800-900 years. Now, what happens is, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, all of a sudden, not only do people start learning more Tanakh, but they start learning it differently than was classically learned. And this we'll get into Amir Tishim a little bit later, how Gush has been part of this. But I'm just describing something that has nothing to do with Gush. It's 150 years ago. It's 1880. Gush is 1967, 1968. But it's a long, long process of renewed interest in Tanakh and renewed interest in the land of history and in the book of Geula and the book of history. And all of a sudden, people are starting to learn Tanakh with greater fervor and greater verve. Now, what is happening? How does Gush play a role in this? And what is the difference in style? So Gush has played a major, major role in this, primarily because as the first and largest Hesder yeshiva, a pace setter for other yeshivos, it has attracted some of the leading names in the modern Tanakh world. And I'll talk about what I mean by the modern Tanakh world in a moment. But when you mention Rav Yoel ben Nun, he was one of the paratroopers who liberated the old city. Talmud of Rav Tzvi Yehuda, who was the son of course, Rav Kook. So he was the Talmud of Rav Tzvi Yehuda in Merkaz. And you mention Rav Yaakov Meidan. Rav Yaakov Meidan is the Rosh Hashiva of Gush. His father, Rav Meir Meidan, wrote the Quran Tanakh. I should say that differently. Hashem wrote the Tanakh, but Rav Meir Meidan, the father of Yaakov Meidan, edited the Quran Tanakh. We'll talk about the Quran Tanakh in a moment, what the Quran Tanakh does and doesn't do. And now modern people or younger people like Rav Amnon Bazak and Rav Yoni Grossman, those are the four people that when they come to town, hundreds of people show up for Tanakh. It's like saying Rav Schechter and Rabbi Willig in YU or in the American scene, or Azi Rav Lipiansky, someone that is well known for their Gemara learning, for their halacha learning. When they come and speak, people want to hear them speak. Now, a lot of Americans have heard Rabbi Liebtag, who's the American voice and the English voice of this Tanakh, but a lot of his Torah comes from Rav Yoel ben Nun, and comes from Rav Bazak, and comes from Rav Yaakov Meidan. So the yeshiva has been instrumental in launching this. And alongside of that, not that this interests you, but it may interest you, we started about 40 years ago the Herzog College. The Herzog College now has 3,000 students, men and women, and boys come from all over the country to study to be Tanakh teachers, boys and girls, in the Israeli public school system. So if you go to Israeli public school in any city, they have X amount of courses in Tanakh. So we took it upon ourselves to train the teachers. So boys come from all the Hesder yeshivos. I don't just mean Hakotel, Shalavim, and Keren V'Yavda. I mean all the 80 Hesder yeshivos. They'll come 2-3 days a week to study Tanach in the Gush. So the Gush has become a mecca of Tanach learning. And it all comes to a head in the summer when we have a Tanach week of study. We have about 250 shiurim. Each day there are about 7 or 8 slots, and each slot there are 5 or 6 shiurim. And before Corona, when we were at the high, there were 10,000 people who came to gather to learn Tanach in the yeshiva's campus, which made it the largest Torah gathering in the national religious Dati Leumi world. So Gush didn't start the Tanach revolution, but it certainly is responsible for taking it, let's say, from 1968 to the current world that you know today. Now, it depends. A lot of your high schools don't really have Tanakh. Sometimes I'll ask a kid, tell me, do you learn Tanakh in your high school? And I'll say, yeah, I do Shtayim Mikra Taragin. It's cute. That's not Tanakh. It's Parsha. Some of you have more Tanakh. Again, depending, Jonathan, Yonatan, in SAR, you have a lot of Tanakh Rabbeim who learned in Gush or learned from people who were inspired by Gush and come back and teach it. Some other schools, it's less prevalent. So that's been Gush's role in the Tanakh revolution. Now let me describe to you what the revolution is, and then I'll give you a couple examples. Okay, very quick here. Typically, even those people who study Tanakh essentially saw it through the lens of Chazal. How did Chazal study Psukim? Chazal studied Psukim in what you could call, I studied literature, I have a PhD in literature, so I know what these terms mean. It's called deconstructionist. It means you take a sentence and you break it down. Why is there an extra vav? Why is there not a yud? Why is there a double language? Why do you use this word? So instead of reading sentences and paragraphs and chapters, large blocks of text, you'll break it down. And essentially the premise is that the Torah is a code. So if it says this word in this parsha and this word in this parsha, we can make a gzera shava and bring halachos from one parsha to another. That's not the way you read a novel. You don't read a novel, so I found the word in chapter 10, I found the word in chapter 20, I can assume that the two chapters are talking about the same thing. And of course not, because Hashem coded the Torah in many, many layers. Chazal say there are 70 layers to reading the Torah. The Mekubalim say that it's not 70, it's 70 cubed. So all you math geeks can try to figure out what 70 cubed is. I can't. But that's how many layers there are to learning Torah. And Chazal, because their primary interest was not reading the story of Parshas Bo, but drawing halacha from Parshas Bo, took each word and say, this word teaches us this halacha, this word teaches us this halacha, this word teaches us this halacha, based on Kal V'chomer, Gzera Shava, Hekesh, Klal U'Pratu Klal, Miyot and Riboy. So they basically tore the text apart, broke it into small little pieces, and what can you see from this word or that word? That was the tradition that we fell into. It's not wrong, it's only one way to read Tanakh. And even people who wrote on the Torah, it becomes your way. You could be the biggest Gadol Ador, but you'll follow the Masorah that your Rebbe taught you. And that's been our Masorah. In the modern context, people have started to say, now let's take a step back, and in addition to reading it that way, not in place of it, but in addition to reading it that way, let's start to read chapters, sentences, and let's try to look at what's called, here's the word, meta-analysis and structural analysis. And I'll give you examples. Meta-analysis is, what is this book trying to deliver compared to this book? Or when the Torah describes Matan Torah in Yisro and Matan Torah in Mishpatim, as we'll see, what do the 20 psukim in Yisro convey? What do the 20 psukim in Mishpatim convey? What's the difference between the first 40 prakim of Yeshaya and the last 40 prakim of Yeshaya? So you're talking about large blocks of text rather than a letter and a word and a diak and a gzera shava and a double lashon. So the double lashon is taking the pasuk and ripping it to shreds and saying, here's an idea, here's an idea, here's an idea. Whereas meta-analysis is, let's look at the overall. The second thing that's become very, very popular in Eretz Yisrael is, let's look at the structure and word use and how the sentence is structured. Those of you who study English, it could be noun, verb, or verb, noun, verb, or verb, noun, or words that are placed together. So let's not just try to say, well, what's the pasuk telling us? But let's think about how is the pasuk written, what words, and that can provide another layer of meaning. And that's called structural analysis. So the two areas of Tanakh that have become very popular as an enhancement, and what makes it really exciting is when you take all these new ways to learn Tanakh, and put it alongside the traditional ways, let's say the Ramban, and so now how do they interact with one another? How does this new way help me understand what the Ramban was saying? This is something that we weren't active in over the last 800-900 years, even when we studied Tanakh. There are a few exceptions. Those of you who have read the Abarbanel, the Abarbanel will take large chunks and ask a lot of questions and then give a topical discussion of those 20 psukim. The Netziv actually learns that way, if you've read the Hamikdavar. But if you pick up your average garden variety parish on the Parsha, it'll be, what does this word teach us? And what does it teach us about Yaakov? What does it teach us about Yosef? Rather than, in addition, trying to look at big blocks of text and also the structure. And that's something that in yeshiva we stress, and it's stressed two ways. It's stressed primarily because Rabbi Liebtag teaches 5 sessions a week in Tanakh, 5 afternoon sessions. They're all optional, but most guys take 2, 3, 4, 5, depending upon your interest, but you're going to pick it up. It's also stressed because the environment is so Israeli, so even if you don't go to Rabbi Liebtag Shiur, you're sitting next to Israelis and your best friends, and they're quoting Tanakh left and right. At a certain point, you say, you know what, I better start learning some Tanakh. It's in the water, not just in the classroom. It's in the water because you're so close to the Israelis, and this is something they've been learning for many, many years in high school. In high school, these are things that are obvious to them. It's not a big chiddush to them. It's in their divrei Torah. They're all writing articles. So say in America, you get up to give a Torah for high school, you say, oh, I saw a pshat in the Meshech Chachma, and I saw a Sfas Emes, and that's your Torah. Whereas the average Israeli will get up and say, oh, I've read the Parsha. This structure, these words, this approach strike me. And so all of a sudden, your mind space is not just reading the Sfas Emes and reading the Nesiv Shalom. Not that there's anything wrong with that, but there's a whole different way to read, and that should complement your way of reading. Now, in other yeshivos, when they're not learning Tanakh, they're not playing volleyball. They're learning more Gemara. So it's not good or bad, but we feel that we want you to walk out of Gush at least knowing your way around Tanakh, knowing your way more or less what the Svarim are, how to read Psukim, and a lot of people say, I'll get to Tanakh later in my life. You know what happens when you push things off later in your life. You keep pushing them off, and this we feel is the time of your life to start closing the gap and picking up some of these skills. Okay? So that's just an introduction of what happened historically. When did it change? Around 1880 and onwards. What role has Gush played? 1968, moving into the modern era. And what types of things you'll see. Mirz Hashem, I want to give you just a few examples. Now, I hope my computer holds up because everything seems very slow tonight, but let me see if I could share a few pages with you, and you'll start to see what I'm talking about. Now, before I share the pages, let me just, while we're sharing, okay, you can see it. Part of what made this whole style of learning Tanakh so meaningful is the development of the Quran Tanakh. I'll just pull one up for my Svarim here, right? So if you're using a Mikros Gedolos and you open up the Mikros Gedolos, so how many psukim are you looking at a time, right? Very few, maybe 7 or 8 or 9 psukim. But if you open up a Quran Tanakh, right, then all of a sudden you're looking at major blocks of text. So the publication of the Quran Tanakh, which didn't exist 120 years ago, means that now it's just you're looking at a whole different text, even though it's the same words, and your mind is parsing it a little bit differently. Okay, so let me see what I'm going to share with you. Okay, let's start with this. Let's see if I can move it along. Okay, let's start with comparing big blocks of texts. So I mentioned to you before, if you look at Parshas Yisro describes Har Sinai. And Har Sinai in Parshas Yisro is very scary, very dark, very cloudy. Look at my cursor. I'm coming in a very thick cloud. Make sure they don't pass the boundary, gvul. Then Hashem says something very scary. If you touch the mountain, you die. And by the way, I'm going to repeat that you're going to die. Don't even touch it with your hand. You'll be stoned to death. Even animals that get close to Har Sinai won't live. Now the day happens. The day happens. There's lightning and thunder and clouds and everyone's shaking and quaking and there are big sounds. The mountain is billowing in fire. Har Sinai Yashan Kulo. The entire mountain is shaking. You get the gist. Moshe gets sent down to warn them not to get too close. Har Sinai's over. They're frightened to death. Vayara this is after the Sarasa Dibros. Vayanu, Vayamdu Merachok. They run away. They stand far away. Please, Hashem, don't speak to us anymore. We're going to die. So what happens in the end? Hashem says, well, it's good that you're afraid of me. Vayamoda am merachok. They stand at a distance. And Moshe nigash el harafel. So Har Sinai in Parshas Yisro is very frightening. A lot of clouds, a lot of smoke, a lot of fire, a lot of warnings, a lot of death, a lot of shaking and quaking. Then you get to Har Sinai Mishpatim, and the description in Mishpatim. Oh, do I not have it here? Wait, let me see if I can find it here. Let me open it for a second. I'll find it for you. I apologize. For some reason, I can't find it. It's not opening. Oh, here it is. Okay, then you get to the second version in Mishpatim. V'el Moshe Amar Elel Hashem Ata Aaron Nadav Avihu Shivim Mizikni. So everyone come up, all of you, Aaron, Nadav, Avihu, 70 Zikanim, come on up. And what do? They write the Torah, Vayiven Mizbeach, they build a Mizbeach, and they build a Matzeva. They're not running away, they're running towards. Vayikach Moshe Chatzi Hadam Vayasem Magano. He takes the blood of the carbon, puts half into the Kalim and half on the Mizbeach. And he calls out to the people, we're making a bris with Hashem, Hine Dam a bris, we're together with Hashem. Vayal Moshe, V'Aaron, Nadav, V'Avihu, Shivim Miziknes, everyone's coming up. Vayechasu es Elokim, they see Hashem. Vayochlu, Vayishtu. They all start eating and drinking. So here you have two very different versions of Kabbalah Torah. One which is fear, and you can't get close to Hashem, you can't understand Hashem, the mountain is smoke, it's a mystery. And then you have Matan Torah with joy and Mizbechos and everyone coming forward and seeing Hashem and eating and drinking. Why? Were there two Har Sinais? Of course there are two Har Sinais. There's only one Har Sinai. But there are two ways we relate to Hashem. One is called Yiras Hashem. Yira doesn't mean fear. Yira means distance. You don't know Hashem. One is called Avas Hashem. And each version of Matan Torah is meant to demonstrate a different interface between ourselves and HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And you only get that by reading 20 psukim in Yisro and 20 psukim in Mishpatim, because there's no one word that tips you off. You have to read the entire section. Okay, another example, even more powerful than that. Another example of meta-analysis. Okay, where are we here? Here we go. I'm sorry. Okay, so let me get the new page up here. Okay, so you guys can see the new page. In which book of Tanach, I'm giving it away, do you have a man or a woman who suffers everything? They lose their family, their wealth, their prestige, their health, reputation, their health. What am I describing? Anyone want to clock in? Open your mic.
Eov.
And what else am I describing?
Root.
Because that's what happens to Naomi. And I've given you 3 parallels between Sefer Ruth and Sefer Eov. I promise you they're over 30, if you know what you're looking for. I've just given you 3. Eov in Parachav Zayin says, Hashem made me very bitter. Shakai heimar nafshi. Hashem made me very bitter. Well, who else do you think says Hashem made me bitter? Naomi, when she returns from Stay Moab. Atomer Elohem, al tekrenali Naomi. Don't call me Naomi, sweet. Grenali Mara, call me bitter. Ki heimar shakai li mod. You see? No one else in Tanakh uses that term, I'm bitter. In fact, very few people in Tanakh use the term shakai, shin daled yud. It appears a lot in Bereshis and very, very seldom in the rest of Tanakh. Only in Ruth and Eov. And then when her friends see Naomi, part Beis, Vateom kol ha'ir, they're all shocked and they say, Hazos Naomi, is this the beautiful Naomi who's coming back? She looks disfigured. She looks terrible. She looks ugly for all the suffering. What happens with Eov, Perak Beis, when his friends see him in his deathbed? Lo hikiru, they didn't recognize him. The only time in Tanakh people suffer and people can't recognize him after they suffer. In the end of the Sefer, when Eov is redeemed and Naomi is redeemed, what's Eov's reward? Vayechi Eov achrei zos, he lives after this whole episode, another 140 years, and he sees children, grandchildren and great-grandchildren, 4 generations. Well, who else gets to see 4 generations as their redemption? You know how Ruth ends. Salmon is Boaz's father. Boaz, Ruth's husband, gives birth to Oved, 1. Oved gives birth to Yishai, 2. Yishai gives birth to David. 4 generations. Boaz, Oved, Yishai, and David. Those are 3 of the over 30 similarities between the book of Eov and the book of Ruth. Why? Well, here's a quick share. Because Hashem wants to highlight the 2 books by all these cross-links, because there's one difference. And for that difference to stand out, everything else has to be the same. In the book of Eov, where human beings suffer divine injustice, they all ask, why is this happening? And each of Eov's friends who come to visit him gives a different explanation for why Hashem is making Eov suffer. In the book of Ruth, no one asks why when people suffer. You know what they do? They ask, what can we do to help? How can we perform chesed to rebuild a broken world? How do you respond when there's suffering in the world? You spend your time asking why? Good luck with that. You're never going to get an answer. Or you spend your time saying, how can I rebuild this world through chesed and stepping out of the box and selflessness? For that message to come across, Ruth has to be identical to Eov with only that difference. If it's not identical, you're not going to read them together. So it's not just reading 15 psukim in Yisro and 15 psukim in Mishpatim, it's reading an entire book together. Eov versus Ruth, and not verses alongside of Ruth. Or a third example of meta-analysis. Okay, I'll move ahead. I don't want to take your time. But the famous question, I don't have it here, about if you read the first 40 prakim of Yeshaya, Yeshaya is extremely caustic in berating the Jewish people. Just open up the first parak of Yeshaya and he lambasts the Jewish people for all their failures and all of their betrayals, and even an ox knows Hashem, and even a donkey follows his master. Then all of a sudden in parak Mem, to the end, which is in the late nuns, for the next 20 prakim, all of a sudden, the last 20 prakim of Yeshaya, Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, all the haftarahs about how much Hashem loves us, and how much Hashem is going to have Rahmanas on us. Why is the beginning of Yeshaya so harsh, and the end of Yeshaya is so compassionate, and so loving, and so optimistic? This dichotomy between the first 40 prakim and the end of Yeshaya led people to suggest, we don't believe, because of course we believe in Nevuah, that actually there were 2 different Yeshayas, 2 different authors, and the last 40 prakim were written by someone else. Now, how do we solve those problems, knowing that it's written by one person called Yeshaya al pi Ruach HaKodesh? So that's a third example. 2 Har Sinais, 2 different Svarim, Eov and Rus, 2 different sections in Yeshaya. Those are 3 different examples of meta-analysis. Now let's move over to structure. I'm going to give you 3 different examples of looking at structure, not meta-analysis, but looking at the way prakim are structured. So, for example, there's something called, a milah mancha. Milah mancha is where there's one word that dominates a section, and especially if that word is repetitive and unnecessary, why is the Torah going out of its way to keep saying that word again and again and again and again? So I'll give you 2 examples. One is from the Akedah. Take your son. We know the Yitzchak is Avram's son. We don't need to know that he's his son. A few psukim later, we get it. We know Yitzchak is Avram's son. We don't need the Torah to tell us this. We know this. We read Bereshis. He puts the word on his son Yitzchak. Okay, I think we're getting the point. Why do we need to know that he's the son? And then he talks to Avram, Aviv, Vayomer Aviv, he says, Abba. Okay, Vayomer Neni Bini, my son. Elokim, Yir Lo Asel Leolah Bini. Vayaval Makom Shama Lo Elokim. V'im Shamar Mizbeach, Vayakor Yitzchak Bino. Esabachelas Lishchot Es Bino. Vayikol Malach Hashem, Velo Chasach Es Bincha. You didn't keep your child. Velo Tachas Bino. Lo Chasach Es Bincha. Probably about 15, 16 times. why does the Torah keep using the word bincha when we absolutely don't need it? So one answer is, and many answers to this question is, the Torah is trying to tell us that Avram, despite the fact that he has a mitzvah to kill Yitzchak, to slaughter Yitzchak, he doesn't objectify Yitzchak into a piece of meat. Anyone who wants to be a mass murderer out there, you know who you are. The easiest way to kill someone is to dehumanize them and to turn them into an object. Chas v'shalom, that's what the Nazis did. That's what people do when you want to kill someone. Because if it's a human being, chas v'shalom, how could you kill them? But if it's just an object, yeah, it's all right. Avram refuses to objectify Yitzchak. He loves him so much, he knows he has to follow Hashem's command. There's no choice. That's orthodoxy. But he doesn't want to give up his love for Yitzchak. And he's struggling as a human being who loves his son to still fulfill Hashem's mitzvah, which is a higher level of the mitzvah. Because if Avram just empties his heart of any fatherly love, then what is he? So the Torah is stressing that Avram keeps seeing Yitzchak as his son. Okay, one example. Another example, Parshas Chayesara, since we're in the area. Avram sends his Eved. Guess what? The Eved puts his hand under Avram's hip. He makes a shvuah. He takes 10 camels from the camels of his master. He hitches the camels outside of the saloon when he gets there. And she tells him, Rivka, I'll give your camels to drink also. And she finishes giving him to drink. And she gives the camels, again, this is 7. And then she gives the water the 3rd time to the camels. And then when the camels stop drinking, then he takes out jewelry and he gives it to her. And then when the servant tells the story, he says, I was standing by the camels. And I said to her, she said, you can come and, Lavan says, come into the house and we have place for your camels. So he comes to the house and they open up the camels and they let the camels lie down and they give hay to the camels. And you can see how many times. I think it's 17 times the word camels appears. And guys, you don't really need 17 mentions of camels. All of these are artificial. Why in the world is this story centered around camels? What do the camels mean symbolically? And the Tana's help us better understand what's happening in this story. Well, the answer is twofold. Number one, because to get to Iraq, you can't travel on a donkey. To get from Hebron to Yerushalayim, you can travel on a donkey. It's a 2-day journey. To get to Iraq and Syria, where the Eved Avram is going to, you need camels because they're perfectly suited for traveling in the desert because they have hard, thick skin on their elbows where they lie down and they can retain their water. So this is basically Avram's first international mission. Until this point, all of his interactions have been local in Eretz Canaan with the Plishtim, with Melchizedek, with the 4 kings and the 5 kings. Now Avram is exporting the revolution and his ideas to his family up in Iraq and Iran. So the camels convey the fact that they're traveling a long distance. So it's a stylistic, it's called a tropy or trope. It's a literary trope to get you to think, oh, this is long distance, not short distance. Vayera, he travels on a donkey to get to the Akedah. In Chayesara, his Eved has to travel on a camel because he's not going to Yerushalayim, he's going overseas. He's going international. And you need camels to travel. So the camels clue you in into what's happening. And of course, camels can carry bigger loads than donkeys. What were the loads that the camels were carrying? Jewels, because part of Avram's mission is to give welfare to everyone. V'yei bracha. So this is Avram giving bracha to his family that he left 3 parshas ago, which is why the camels, 1 second, Moshe, is so important. 1 second, Moshe. How do I know that? Look at this word, and when you start to see words, you start to see things you've never seen before. When they hitch the camels, when he first arrives, so what does the Torah say? What does he do to the camels when he hitches them? Where is it? Here. Let me get the word, you'll see it. Get ready, it's worth the wait. You see this pasuk when he arrives in town and he puts the camels down, what does it say? Vayavrech hagimalim. What does vayavrech mean? He makes them bend down on their knees, which is what camels do when they stop walking and they rest. But what word does vayavrech sound like? Anyone?
Baruch, like bracha.
Bracha, v'yei bracha. So the camels are the tools of bracha because they're carrying all the jewelry. Because you can't carry the jewelry on your back, you need camels. So for us to know that this is Avram exporting his ideas long distance and bringing jewelry, you want to see the camels front and center. That's called milah mancha, a leading word that dominates the section. And that's just one structural device. Who had a question? Moshe, you had a question? Go ahead. Are you still
I feel like that doesn't explain. I feel like that doesn't explain why it's said so many times, though. I feel like you could have gotten that just from like a couple here and there, not with like a full milama ancha.
Okay, so sometimes the Torah wants to draw your attention and repeats the pasuk many times and the word many times. You can ask why you need 17 rather than 10, but you always want to follow a milah mancha. Whenever there's a word that's outsized and dominates the text more than it has to, you want to understand why it's playing such an important role. Okay, but it's fair to say that that's what I said is insufficient. You'd look for a different answer. But Moshe, the phenomena is undeniable. The fact that it says it so many times, you have to give an answer. You want to give a different answer, but these are not the types of things that Rashi typically speaks about. Okay, so that's one form of structure, milah mancha. Another form of structure is within a pasuk, when the Torah or the Tanach alters the normal A, B, A, B. I went to the store and I got some water. Noun, verb, noun, verb. What happens when the Tanakh turns it around and it's noun, verb, verb, noun, noun, noun? It's called, in literature, it's called enjambment, where you take a structure and you invert it. Let me give an example of enjambment. Let me shut some of these. Okay? Or it's called, if you want a fancy word, it's called chiastic structure. Chiastic structure, instead of A, B, A, B, is A, B, B, A. So, for example, in Parshas Noach, here's a perfect example of chiasmic structure, where the nouns and the verbs are inverted. Shofech dam ha'adam, if you pour the blood of a man, ba'adam damo yishafech. For a man, your blood will be spilt. It should be shofech dam ha'adam yishafech damo. Why do you have verb, noun, noun, verb? Shofech dam ha'adam, ba'adam damo yishafech. It should be shofech dam ha'adam, if you pour the blood of a man, yishafech damo bi'adam, beitin, human beings will take your life and kill you. Instead of that, you have verb, noun, noun, verb. You see? Why? Because by switching it around, verb, noun, noun, or verb, noun, noun, verb, you take the two word Adam and you put them right in the middle side by side. You see that? And you highlight the fact that Adam is so special. And by taking his life, you've taken a masterpiece of Hashem. You're putting the word Adam front and center. If it be Shofech Dam Adam, Yishafech Damo Bi Adam, then the two Adams will be separate from one another. Or if you're looking for when let me turn this around a little bit. If I can turn it around. Can I turn it around? Turn this around. Okay, I can't give this because it's upside down. Let me give another one. Okay, here's one. Okay. The end of Perek Aleph in Tehillim. Lucky is the man that doesn't follow the wicked people. Ki yodea Hashem derech tzadikim. Hashem knows and recognizes the way of the righteous people. V'derech rishayim toved. And he eliminates, or he destroys the way of the wicked people. Again, verb, noun, noun, verb. Yodea is the verb. Derech tzadikim is the noun, the way of the righteous. Derech rishayim, the way of the wicked. Toved, Hashem destroys. Why? Because by switching around the order, instead of going noun, verb, it's noun, verb, noun, you put basically derech tzadikim and derech rishayim side by side. Because it's free will. Make a choice. Derech tzadikim, derech rishayim. What are you going to choose? They're right up against each other. You can be a tzaddik, you can be a rasha. You have to make the choice. So these are very, very simple examples of what's called ABBA, which is called chiasmic structure. Now, I've given you these examples within one pasuk. You can sometimes see it within a parak. You can see it within a parsha. You can see ABBA, not just within a pasuk, but within much, much larger structures. And why is the order and the sequence being inverted? Okay, so that's another literary device that helps you see things that you wouldn't otherwise see. It's not the end of your analysis. It's just, okay, now I'm seeing things. Why does it happen like that? Okay, finally, I'll give you an example of what's called concentric structure, where it's not inverted structure, ABBA, but it's cyclical. So if you take a look at, this is just my writing for you to see it. You take a look at the story of Megillas Esther. The story of Megillas Esther has, let's call it 8 sections, a midsection, and then another 8 sections, 8 stories. And 1 is parallel to 16, 2 is parallel to 15, 3 is parallel to 14. Basically, you're creating, and I'll show you, let me see if I can shrink this. I'm going to go out for a second and try to shrink this for you. How do I go out? I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to go into my, I'm just going to shrink it a little bit so you can see it. Okay, this will help you see it. Now I can share it. Okay, so here you see the entire superstructure of what's happening, okay? So it begins with the intro is Achashverosh's power, his party, his power, his wealth. The next scene is the two Persian parties that he makes. He's making parties for his noblemen and the overall population. So first the Torah describes that he is the ruler of 127 kingdoms. Then we have the two parties he makes. The next scene is Esther appears before the king because she's chosen. That's in Perek Beis. Then you have Perek Gimel, the promotion of Haman. These are different scenes. Then you have the casting of a lottery, which day the war will take place. The delivery of the ring to Haman. Esther's first party. Haman consults his family what to do. Now let's skip the mid-range. Each of these has a parallel after that night when he can't sleep. Remember, Haman consults his family? He consults his family after he gets embarrassed and he says, uh-oh, you're in big trouble. Because you've already started to fall behind the Jews. Remember Esther's first party, G? Esther's second party. Remember giving the royal ring to Haman? Well, Achashverosh gives the royal ring to Mordechai after he finds out who Haman was. Remember the lottery when the war will take place? Well, the war takes place afterwards. Remember the promotion of Haman? That's paralleled by the promotion of Mordechai. Remember Esther appeared before the king to be chosen? Well, Esther appears before the king to ask for an extra day to fight in Shushan. Remember the two Persian parties in Perek Aleph? Well, there are two Jewish parties in Perek Tes. One in all the Medinot on the 14th and one in Shushan on the 15th. Remember the story began with Achashverosh's power? It ends with his power and the taxes he levies upon all the kingdoms. So you basically have, this is called concentric, 1:16. It's like At Bashgar, Aleph and Tuf, Beis and Shin. So 1 and 16, 2 and 15, 3 and 14. Why? Because you want to highlight the midpoint. By doing this, you highlight the midpoint. What's the midpoint? The night that he couldn't sleep and the ride through town. So that's where everything's happening. That doesn't have a parallel. That's alone. It's in the middle. And therefore, you're highlighting that's the shift in the story. By creating a structure, you see all the lines I had? B goes to B1 and C goes, these are just all the lines I made for you to show the concentric structure. So this is the second type of thing that people are doing today in Eretz Yisrael. One is called meta-analysis, large blocks of text, Yisro, Mishpatim, Rus, Eov, Yeshaya. One is called literary structure, nouns, verbs, dominant words, secondary words, concentric structure. And you don't just do this for fun. But this, okay, now I'm seeing certain things. Now how do I interpret it? Now that I see the reason it's structured this way, what's the message Hashem is telling me? And what's the message the Nabi's telling me? Okay? So I'm sorry about the cut up in the middle, but this is why Tanach is so meaningful to us. And we want you to get a little bit of this taste, both through the Shiurim, as well as just the environment. You'll see it's just very, very Tanach. The Israelis come, and this is something that's almost second nature to them. Okay? Capish? Okay, thank you guys for coming, especially to the English boys who aren't off today. Laila Tov.